This program is sponsored in part by the Reinhardt Foundation, located in San Diego and dedicated to community projects in Mexico and Guatemala, helping others help themselves. And by Varig Airlines. Varig flies daily from Los Angeles, Miami, New York, and Mexico to Brazil.
Hello, my name is Jeffrey Davidow, and welcome to the Institute of the Americas on the campus of the University of California, San Diego. Today, we're interviewing His Excellency Rubens Barbosa, the Ambassador of Brazil to the United States, in one of a series of programs we call Encuentros, meetings in Spanish, but today we're calling it Encuentros, meetings in Portuguese. Mr. Ambassador, welcome, and thank you for being with us. You are Brazil's most senior diplomat. You've had a lot of appointments overseas. You were Brazil's ambassador to the United Kingdom, and for the last 5 years you've been in Washington. What's the difference between doing business with the government of the United Kingdom and doing business with the government of the United States? Is it a different world? As a professional diplomat, you have to act differently?
Well, I think that dealing with the authorities here, with the business community here is easier, straightforward, direct. In Britain there are formalities, takes longer, the decision-making process there is longer, is more conservative. So I think that dealings with the United States companies and government is easier, quicker, and more efficient.
Yet you have expressed some frustrations about dealing with the United States, particularly on the question of the negotiation of a free trade area of the Americas. Do you think that U.S. policy is conducive to the creation of a hemispheric-wide free trade policy, or do you think we have elements of our policy which impede that?
Well, all of us are working to the creation of this FTAA, the Free Trade Area of the Americas. Each country is defending its own interest. The United States is defending its own interest in a very difficult moment, because we are in an election year. The Congress is very restrictive. Protectionism prevails today in the Congress. And I understand the reasons why the United States is pursuing perhaps to facilitate and to defend better its own interest, these bilateral trade agreements. In the FTAA, we need Brazil defending its own interest as well. We are trying to get a balanced result. It's not possible to get a free trade area in which there was not a feeling that everybody is benefiting. It's not a win-win situation. We need to have FTAA that is possible, that is balanced, in which everybody may say that they won something. And according to our view, so far, this has not been the case, because the United States wants to have certain negotiations in rules, for instance, that go beyond what we have in the FTA, what we have in the WTO. But on the other side, anti-dumping and subsidies, for instance, important rules will stay out. And there are other examples in trade facilitation, in the trade liberalization area as well. So what we think is that the FTAA is important. In the case of Brazil, 55% of our exports go to the hemisphere. Out of this 55%, 80% are industrialized goods, are not raw material, not primary products, are industrialized goods. So we have a concrete interest in these negotiations in two senses. First, in the trade liberalization. We want really free trade and fair trade. And second, in the definition of rules, balanced rules that will allow us to develop and not to be tied up by rules that have not been approved in the WTO.
Brazil has traditionally complained, and in these current negotiations is very assertive, about U.S. agricultural subsidies. Can you tell us, how does an agricultural subsidy, for instance, on corn or grains in the United States, affect Brazil and Brazil's capacity to either enter the U.S. market or other markets?
Well, if you take the 10 major items of our exports to the United States, there's not a single agricultural primary product, no commodity. Brazil is the largest meat exporter in the world, and we cannot export a single ton to the United States due to restrictions that exist here. 33% of Brazilian products are affected in one way or another by U.S. restrictions here. Subsidies affect Brazil in different ways. First, in some products, perhaps we are not exporting because of the subsidies you have here. And second and most important, subsidies affect us in third markets. That's why I say that we're in favor not only of free trade but fair trade, because we are affected by unfair trade practices in third markets. Another consequence of the subsidies is a huge domestic surplus in some products, and the United States sometimes gives as concession, as aid, agricultural products, and sometimes to important markets, to give to Russia, to Eastern European countries, as concession, surplus that were generated because of subsidies. This is unfair trade.
All of these issues relating to subsidies apply, I would think, in relation to Brazil's ties with the European Union, where subsidies are actually at a higher level than they are in the United States. Is this a big issue in your conversations with the Europeans as well?
We are as assertive to Europe as we are with you here. We are negotiating with the European Union an agreement, Mercosur, European Union, and we said very clear and loud that if there was no movement, because we understand your position and Europe's position, we cannot have subsidies disappearing overnight. There are political constraints, there are limitations that we understand. What we are very vocal and we cannot accept is that there is no move, as you say, in the right direction, trying to reduce or to eliminate these subsidies. We are saying the same thing to Europe. And Europe is negotiating with us. Agriculture is the major issue with the negotiations with Europe because, as I said, we export $16 billion to the United States. 80%, 77% to be precise, of this 16 billion are industrialized goods. In Europe is different. Of our exports, around the same thing, a bit more. 65% are agriculture and raw material. So the composition of trade is different, and agriculture for us in Europe is central, more important than the United States. And if there is no move in Europe in agriculture, there will be no agreement.
I understand. You've spoken about the general absence of knowledge about Brazil in the United States. You are concerned that Brazil gets put in the same package with all of the rest of Latin America. And indeed, you've said that there really is no Latin America as we learn about it in the United States. Could you explain more about that?
No, I didn't say that there's no Latin America. What I said that is the concept of Latin America is outmoded, because the concept of Latin America was created in the 19th century by a French sociologist to justify Maximilian in Mexico. France had to have an explanation why they were doing that. And they created this concept, a cultural concept of Latin America, because French is Latin as well. So now what I'm saying is that the concept has to be replaced, because if you're talking about trade, if you're talking about finance, if you talk about economics in general, no company or very few companies would refer to Latin America. They would refer to North America, including Mexico, Central America, CARICOM, and South America. So we prefer today to refer to our environment as South America, not Latin America. Of course, in the cultural area is different. There is a Latin culture. But even so, the differences between Brazil and other South American countries, Latin countries, is huge, starting with the language and different forms of culture. So as far as we are concerned, as Brazil sees our role in the hemisphere, we think that South America is a more accurate and more precise description of the region.
The United States has two neighbors, Canada and Mexico. And our relations are generally pretty good, although there are a lot of trouble in trade and migration. Brazil has 10 neighboring countries to deal with. How do the situations, for instance, in some of your neighboring countries impact upon Brazil? I'm thinking in particular, for instance, of Venezuela, which has, at the very least, and I'm not going to ask you to comment on the third country, a very strained, very difficult internal domestic relations, domestic situation with President Chavez. Is this something that, A, is of concern to Brazil, and B, is there any room for Brazilian diplomacy in trying to bring about in Venezuela or Colombia or other countries that are your neighbors having difficulty to bring about solution to these problems?
Well, I thought you would mention Colombia, because this is the real problem that we have there, and the situation there has presented already a few problems at the border. Brazil has no problem with any neighboring country as far as borders are concerned. We have settled all the disputes with borders in the 19th century. So we don't have any bordering problems with any country. And we follow, as you may appreciate, very closely what happens in all neighboring countries, in Argentina, in Uruguay, in Bolivia, in Colombia, Venezuela. And recently, with the new government in Brazil, we also been more assertive in our role in the region. So in terms of Colombia, Brazil suggested the creation of what became known as the supporting group of the Secretary General of the OAS. Brazil, Chile, Mexico, Spain, and Portugal. Brazil, asked by the countries, including the United States, member countries, became the chair of this group. And we are helping all the difficulties that existed in Colombia, and we will be supporting them. We have very good relationship with Chavez, the previous president Cardoso, now Lula, friends of Chavez, and we are trying to moderate and trying to show that Democracy has to prevail there in all sectors, in all issues. And we are trying to help Bolivia with the difficulties they have there. We are having a very proactive attitude in relation to Colombia, with Paraguay, with Uruguay, with Argentina being parts of Mercosur. We also are having very proactive policies to try to help economically these countries. In the case of Bolivia, for instance, Brazil, after the crisis that made President Goni to go, Brazil was the first country to write off the foreign debt, Bolivian foreign debt to Brazil. We're not making speeches around the theme of supporting. We are doing things. We wrote off the debt. We opened $600 million of credits to develop projects in Colombia. We're buying natural gas from Colombia, from Bolivia. So we are doing concrete things to help our neighbors.
With Brazil's new assertiveness internationally, can we expect to see Brazil to bring back the concept of a permanent seat for Brazil on the UN Security Council? Is that still an important element of your foreign policy?
Well, we are not canvassing to do that. We think that Brazil is prepared to take up, to assume new responsibilities. We know that the reform of the Security Council is a broader problem. It can only advance if and when the United States change its position. The United States is reluctant to discuss this and to increase the number of members. And once the discussion is set in motion, Brazil will be ready to present its case. And we know that this is not a question of regional decision. This is a question of international decision. And countries with responsibilities, with a role to play, will be selected. This will be a natural process. We are not going to canvass anything. And if the international community recognizes that Brazil, together with India, with China, with other countries, should join the Security Council, we will be ready to do that. But we will not be canvassing, and will not be accepting any regional solution that is rotation or whatever. If the Security Council is reformed, Brazil will be ready to take up its responsibility, provided that the international community accepts it.
Let me ask you a question about Brazil-U.S. relations. One of the things that the two countries have in common is that they are both great places to visit. Very varied, welcoming populations. Brazilian tourism to the United States has dropped about 40% in recent years. Why?
Because of the new rules and regulations related to the customs. After September 11th, the United States decided to change and to tighten the procedures to grant visas to foreign visitors. And only 27 countries out of nearly 200 are exempt of visas for tourism in the United States. Brazil is not one of them. So Brazilian tourists will have to go to 3 cities in Brazil only, in Brasilia, São Paulo, Rio, to get a visa. They have to submit themselves to a long procedure. They have to pay $140 to get a visa, and if the visa is refused, they lose the money. So it's a very cumbersome and very difficult system. We're not complaining, because each country is sovereign to do whatever it wants to do. It's the U.S. business. We don't complain about that. But this creates repercussions.
So someone who doesn't live in one of those 3 major cities, let's say lives 1,000 or 1,500 miles away, has to make a trip to the city to apply for the visa, may or may not get it, and then and only then could they travel.
Yeah, and they cannot send a passport to get a visa. They have to be there personally because they are personal interview. So this is a system that is going to make the tourism industry here lose money, because it takes time, and fewer people will be able to get the visa because of the time consumed to examine the request. Not to speak practical problems that we had. Brazil perhaps was one of the countries, most affected countries, because of the changes in rules here. For instance, when the transit visa was introduced last year, Varig, the Brazilian airline, was terribly affected because they had a flight from Brazil to Japan. We have a large community of Japanese in Brazil, and vice versa, a large Brazilian community in Japan. And they would travel every day during the week through Los Angeles. And this flight had to be canceled because it was impracticable to have the transit visa for people that were not going to stop here. It was only a stopover there. They wouldn't leave the airport, anything, but and to get the visa was too difficult for short-term visits, and we had to cancel the flight.
I understand. Brazil generally does not get very much press in American media, but in the last year, with the election of President Lula, there's been a lot more interest. How does Lula's presidency differ from, let's say, that of his predecessor, Mr. Cardoso?
In terms of U.S. relation?
No, or in terms of what's happening in Brazil?
Well, both had a vision that they need to stabilize the economy. So in this connection, the policies are in the same direction. They go to the control of inflation, reduce fiscal deficit, stabilize the economy. In the social area, President Cardoso tried to do something, but due to the problems that we faced, 3 international crises from '94, Mexico, China, Asia, and Russia crisis affected the economy, and the stabilization was the top priority. And the social programs, although they advanced very much, especially in health and education, they couldn't get the attention they deserved. President Lula was elected on a platform of social reforms and social emphasis. And he started right from the beginning the Zero Hunger program, alleviation of poverty, and he is committed to do that. This is the expectation of the population who voted in him. And he is trying to give greater attention on the social issues. And as I said in foreign policy, the Lula government is being more assertive in the defense of certain interests of ours, for instance, trade. And we are also looking into a closer cooperation with big countries like Brazil in the southern hemisphere, especially South Africa, China, India. So we are getting more vocal in international fora, in the WTO, in the United Nations, and much more active in the trade negotiations, especially with those large countries.
We have time for one more question. The goal of President Lula to focus on social benefits for the population. There have been other presidents in other countries who have come to power with the same goals, but have run into the difficulties of lack of resources in order to do this. Do you think President Lula is going to be successful? And if so, why do you think that?
Well, depends on what you think, what it is successful. Well, in Latin America, especially in Brazil, given the size of the country, when you look into the social problems, you always have the glass half full or half empty. You know? The magnitude of the problems are enormous, and no one will solve the problems. What we accomplished in the last few years with 98% of children in school age in schools, improvement in social security services, improving the health area, was enormous. And the government lost the election because the perception was it was not enough. So it's difficult to say if Lula will be successful, because he's doing what it's possible to do. He's not cutting social programs while cutting other ministries because of restrictions to keep the fiscal deficit under control and to keep inflation under control. It's very difficult. Some of the programs launched during last year, the first year of government, are in place. But the problems are, the magnitude of the problems are tremendous. And I'm sure that after his term in office, much will have been done, and much will still need to be done.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for being with us today. The Institute of the Americas on the campus of UC San Diego welcomes your comments about this program. You can find out how to contact us at www.iamericas.org. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you.